Every health-conscious person listening to this podcast needs to get this phrase into their vocabulary. Healthy, saturated fat. Say it with me. Healthy, saturated fat. Now, I know that sounds unusual, and I know it might even be hard to say, but if you're still cooking with vegetable oils and eating margarine and cutting back on red meat because you've been told it's heart healthy, fasten your seatbelts. This episode's going to blow your mind. Welcome to the Christian Healthy Lifestyle Podcast, where I help Christians over 40 maximize their health potential so that they can age gracefully, live abundantly, and be thoroughly equipped for every good work. This is part 2 of saturated fat versus seed oils. And in the last episode, we talked about how harmful seed oils are at a biological level. And in this episode, I want to talk to you about how harmful seed oils have been demonstrated to be at an epidemiological level. Now, if you are a victim of a public school education such as myself, epidemiology is the study of diseases in a society. In the last episode, I mentioned how nearly every institution responsible for dietary recommendations has got it wrong. We've been told for decades to lower our consumption of saturated fat, consume more polyunsaturated fats and oils, and therefore will reduce our risk of heart disease. Now, I believe that advice has actually caused a great deal of pain and suffering and could be the worst dietary advice we've ever received. Now, I know that's a bold claim, but I want to elaborate a little bit as to why I believe that's true. Now, in this episode, I'm going to explain how we got here as a nation, and I'm going to share my recommendations for where we go from here. So listen to the end, and I'm going to give you some specific recommendations to avoid seed oils and embrace a healthier way of eating. So a quick review. The diet heart hypothesis says this: when we eat more saturated fat, it increases our LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol causes plaque in the arteries. That leads to heart disease and early death. Now, if you'd like to explore more about the diet heart hypothesis and what that means for us, listen to episode 139 where I talk about statins and cholesterol. Really take a little bit of a deep dive there. So I believe that that advice is absolutely wrong, and I want to tell you why. So the American Heart Association, the American Dietetics Association, the National Institute for Health, the CDC, the USDA, World Health Organization, they are all seemingly in lockstep with that narrative. Reduce your saturated fat intake, increase the polyunsaturated fatty acids or PUFAs, and that's going to be healthier for you. And I'm saying that they all got it wrong. So you might be asking yourself, Dave, how can all these institutions, the people who are paid to make these recommendations, have it all wrong, and little old you sitting in your podcast studio there have got it right? How could that possibly be true? Well, I'm saying it is true, and I want to explain why. So in order to understand how this idea really took root, we need to understand the history and how these ideas formed and how it gained momentum over time to the point where it's really become institutionalized in our society. And it's really become dogma in the medical field. Just go to your family practice doctor and ask him about why he's testing your cholesterol. And he's going to say, well, where have you been for the last 50 years? Cholesterol causes heart disease. Now, I don't consider myself a storyteller, but this is a story that needs to be told. So I'm going to kind of go through this in a bit of a timeline in a little bit of a story format because it's really fascinating. And I really think that someone would do well to make a movie out of this one day, but that'll probably never happen. But it really does read like a Hollywood screenplay when you look at the details here. So in the 19th century, in the 1800s, people were eating large amounts of saturated fat, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, made up about 2% of their total caloric intake. And back then, heart disease was almost non-existent. Today, polyunsaturated fatty acids make up about 20% or more of the average American's diet. And heart disease is the leading killer in America. And non-communicable diseases or chronic degenerative diseases, pretty much the same thing, are all skyrocketing. So after the Civil War, Seed oils started to be used for machinery lubrication. They were starting to replace whale blubber that they used to make oil from because the whale population was starting to become more scarce, and they needed something to replace that. So they were using seed oils as machinery lubrication. And animal fats were still being used for things like candles and soaps, but they were relatively expensive, so they were pursuing some alternatives. Now, unless you were sleeping in American history class in high school, you know that by the late 1800s, cotton production in the U.S. was booming. But no one knew what to do with the cotton seeds, which were a byproduct of growing cotton, which were very, very toxic if you ate them. Now, back then, a new process had just been discovered, and that was hydrogenation, where they take, in a man-made fashion, they take a polyunsaturated fatty acid and turn it into a man-made saturated fat. Now, if you're interested in that, you might want to check out part 1 of this episode. It's episode 141, and I go into the biology behind what makes up a saturated fat, polyunsaturated, and a monounsaturated fat. It is interesting. I recommend you go back and check it out. Episode 141. So a saturated fat is where all the carbon molecules are saturated with hydrogen molecules. In other words, each carbon molecule is paired with a hydrogen and is said to be saturated with hydrogen molecules. So hydrogenation is the process where they artificially saturate those carbon molecules with hydrogen and make a PUFA, or a polyunsaturated fatty acid, behave more like a saturated fat. Now, in the late 1800s, Procter & Gamble started using that new technology on cotton seeds to make what was a toxic waste product an edible food product. In reference to cottonseed oil, the magazine Popular Science wrote this: "What was garbage in 1860 was fertilizer in 1870, cattle feed in 1880, and table food and many other things as well in 1890. So Procter & Gamble started applying this hydrogenation technology, this new technology, not only to cotton seeds, but soybean oil and corn oil as well. And this newfangled man-made fat was about to transform the way food was produced in the United States. Procter & Gamble are the makers of Crisco shortening, vegetable shortening, and that hit the market in 1911. Now, the main ingredient in Crisco is hydrogenated soybean oil. A few years prior to Crisco hitting the market, animal fats were coming under scrutiny from a different angle. In 1906, a gentleman by the name of Upton Sinclair first published his novel, The Jungle. Now, Sinclair was a Marxist, and he was a devout socialist, and he advocated for the government takeover of all big business. Now, he was outraged at what was going on in the meatpacking industry, so he wrote this novel in an attempt to sway public opinion toward that end, towards his socialist goals. Now, the name The Jungle was a metaphor for capitalism. And he wrote this fictional novel that was an account of the mistreatment of workers in the meatpacking industry. He called the town that the setting was in, he called it Packing Town. And he depicted horrible working conditions for the workers and unsanitary meat handling practices in the meatpacking industry. And the novel was very successful. It sold over 150,000 copies in its first year. And readers, instead of being outraged by the treatment of the workers, as he had hoped, they were more concerned about the quality of the meat they were eating. So after that novel came out, shortly thereafter, meat consumption plummeted by almost 20% in the U.S. It was really had a dramatic impact on people's perceptions. And Sinclair himself was quoted as saying this: "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." Now, his book was a fictional novel. He was free to write anything he wanted, and I'm sure there was some truth to the idea that there was some funny business going on in the meatpacking industry with child labor going on and those kinds of things. But nevertheless, the demonization of meat and animal products was underway, and it was picking up steam. A few years later, in 1913, along came a Russian researcher by the name of Nikolai Anichtikov. Now, he did his research in St. Petersburg, Russia, and Anichtikov experimented on rabbits by feeding them diets high in cholesterol, and they developed plaque in their arteries. And with this study results, he got the meats are bad ball rolling even faster by stating that cholesterol in the diet causes heart disease. Now, can you think of a problem with this study? The problem is rabbits are vegetarians and plants don't have cholesterol. A rabbit would never consume cholesterol in the wild with eating its natural diet. So when you feed an animal an unnatural diet, their health will suffer. No surprise there. But we can almost forgive Nietzsche cow for making this mistake because very little was known about atherosclerosis and heart disease at the time, and he was kind of a pioneer in this research. The trouble is, researchers today still consider his experiments and the conclusions that he drew from those to be a valid way of studying heart disease in humans today. Look at this review here, published in the journal Atherosclerosis in 1997. They said, quote, "The cholesterol-fed rabbit is a widely used model for experimental atherosclerosis research. Anichtikau was able to identify the cell types on which modern atherosclerosis research is now focusing." So they're basing their research today, this is about 25 years ago, but it's still going on today. They're basing their research on faulty research that was done in 1913, and they're using that bad research to guide the science today. And that's why I mention this, because it's a big problem, and I believe that's a major mistake. Now, in the meantime, heart disease was on the rise. By the 1940s and 50s, middle-aged men were seemingly dropping like flies from heart attacks. Then along came the Framingham Heart Study. Now, the Framingham Heart Study was perhaps the largest study ever done on heart disease. It's multi-generational. It started in 1948, and it's still ongoing today, which is pretty amazing. But 6 years into the study, in 1954, the researchers announced that they saw a connection between total cholesterol and heart disease deaths, which seemed like the evidence that everyone was looking for at the time. And it gave doctors and medical professionals a soft endpoint to measure someone's risk of heart disease. Before that, it was just kind of guesswork. They really didn't know what was causing heart disease. The problem with the Framingham study is the same problem a lot of studies have, is that it was observational. And observational studies have too many confounding variables to conclude this is fact, to conclude that they've proven anything. Now, we're going to come back to this study in a little bit, but this announcement in Framingham, Massachusetts, it added fuel to the fire for the cholesterol causes heart disease theory. And 1 year later, in 1955, President Eisenhower, the sitting president, had a heart attack while in office. Now, at this point, fear was starting to grip the nation, and people were desperate for some answers. And fear is a powerful motivator. And then along came a gentleman by the name of Ancel Keys. Now, this is the point in the story where I call it the four Ps really comes quite evident, kind of emerges here as an explanation for what was really happening here. In the four Ps, I call them the pursuit of prestige, power, and profit. And those underlying motivations start to kind of take the wheel, so to speak, to the story here. Now, Keys was a research scientist, and he's the father of the diet-heart hypothesis. No one individual had more influence on our government's dietary recommendations than Ancel Keys. Now, Keys had a cozy relationship with certain organizations that were influential, as well as government agencies, namely the American Heart Association and the National Institute for Health. And those relationships paved the way for him getting his theories institutionalized into American thought. His work landed him on the cover of Time magazine in 1961, and then he published the results from his 7 countries study in 1970. And his recommendations to lower our intake of saturated fat and increase our intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, were incorporated into the 1975 Senate Dietary Goals for the United States. So Ancel Keys had a lot of influence. He was the right person in the right place at the right time. It was the perfect storm for the lipid hypothesis to take root. People were afraid. They were wondering what was going on. Seeing their loved ones suffer from heart disease, and people wanted answers. And Keys stepped onto the scene. He was an intelligent, charismatic, hard-headed scientist that would fiercely defend his positions. George Mann was also a research scientist, and he was the associate director of the Framingham Heart Study that we just talked about. And he was a colleague of Ancel Keys, and he knew him personally. Mann was interviewed by Nina Teckles, who wrote the book The Big Fat Surprise, which, by the way, is a great book. It came out in 2014. It's very well written. If this subject interests you, I highly recommend you read that book because she did a masterful job of putting these events together. It's a great read. But anyway, Mann was interviewed by Teckles for her book, and he told her this, quote, "You have to understand what a forceful and persuasive person Keys was. He could talk to you for an hour, and you would utterly believe everything he said." Now, Mann challenged Keys' assumptions about saturated fat and cholesterol, and it destroyed his career. Now, we got to understand what a career as a research scientist looks like. In order to advance your career, you've got to continually pursue funding for your research. The vast majority of funding for nutrition research comes from government grants. The only other source of funding that you might be able to find as a researcher would be from the food industry themselves, which sometimes does happen, but it's far and away considered an inferior source because your data and your conclusions could easily be criticized because of who was paying for the research. So government funding is considered to be more legitimate and more prestigious. And by the way, prestige is a major part of being able to obtain funding for research in the future. That's the way you secure your career. You develop some prestige in the field, and you're able to get more money for future projects down the road. Now, George Mann had a long-term grant from the NIH to study heart disease. He was, in fact, the associate director of the now famous Framingham Heart Study. It took place in Framingham, Massachusetts, and it was probably the largest study ever undertaken to study heart disease. Now, Mann also said in the same interview with Teckles, "One day the study section secretary asked me to step outside in the hall. She said, 'Your opposition to Keys is going to cost you your grant.' And she was right." Because Mann held his ground and continued to question the validity of Keys' diet heart hypothesis, he lost his funding, he was marginalized in the research community, and it destroyed his career. Now, in 1970, Keys published his now famous 7-country study. The 7-country study started in 1958, and it finished in 1970. And the 7 countries that he looked at were the United States, Finland, Yugoslavia, Netherlands, Italy, Greece, and Japan. So Keys' study included 7 countries. Now, he's accused of looking at 22 countries and dropping 15 that didn't support his theories. That's not exactly accurate. There was prior research done that preceded Keys' 7-country study done on 22 different countries. And Keys wasn't personally involved, but he was aware of that data, and he chose the 7 countries that would be most likely to support his thesis. So did he do some cherry picking? Yes, he did, but he didn't investigate all 22 countries himself. He only investigated the 7. Keys was a smart guy, and I believe he was well-intentioned, at least when he started out. Now, I don't think he was intentionally trying to be deceptive. I just think it was simply more like he had blinders on, and he had a strong case of confirmation bias. He was looking to find data that would confirm his position. Now, the main goal of any researcher should be to maintain their objectivity. I had my friend Shanti Feldon on the show back in episode 127, and Shanti is a Harvard-trained PhD researcher, and she's a best-selling author of a number of books on marriage and relationships. And what makes Shanti's writings great is she doesn't just give you her opinions. She lets the results from the research do the talking for her. And that really sets her apart from some of the other authors in that field. Now, Ancel Keys lost that ability that Shanti does so well. That's the ability to remain neutral or objective until the research is fully in. So take an intelligent, hard-headed research scientist like Keys that loves a good debate, that was receiving a great deal of funding for his research, who's anxious to prove his theories is accurate because his prestige, power, and profit are all on the line. Sprinkle in a little pride, and you've got a researcher that's completely lost his objectivity. Keys started out with good intentions, that's what I believe. But later in his career, I believe he was more interested in proving himself right than objectively presenting the research results as they came in. Now we're going to revisit that idea in just a minute. It's gonna be shocking what I'm about to share with you in just a minute. But anyway, the 7-country study did show a correlation, although a weak one, but a correlation to saturated fat consumption and heart disease deaths. Now, remember, in any observational study, correlation doesn't mean causation. The 7-country study was observational. Now, in episode 138, I talk about the differences between observational epidemiology and a randomized controlled trial. The randomized controlled trial is far more scientific and far more reliable. Observational studies are just loaded with confounding variables and shot with flaws. So anyway, the 7-country study was observational, and it was the weakest form at that because it was cross-cultural. It involved different countries with different cultures and different people with different habits and practices. On the 7 countries website itself, this is what I found. They say, quote, ecological or cross-cultural associations are frequently viewed as the lowest level of evidence about causality. And then they go on to say, but in this case, it's different. Our study's better than that. But you can't erase the flaws that are inherently present in any observational cross-cultural study. There's plenty of them. In other words, in epidemiological research, this is as weak as it gets, the 7-country study. Now, in the 7 countries that Keys looked at, the vast majority of these people that died from heart disease did not have autopsies performed. They used data from the country's death certificates. And some countries are not real good at categorizing the real cause of death very accurately. The doctor might say, well, I'm not quite sure why this person died, so they assign their death to a miscellaneous category. Now, Keys only looked at one category for his research, and that category was called atherosclerosis and degenerative heart disease. That was a common category that would be listed on death certificates, and that's the only one Keys used. But there was another category listed on death certificates in these various countries that was called other diseases of the heart. Now, that's similar, related, I suppose, but what that really means, I don't know. But anyway, there's an important point to make here, and that is some of these countries that had the lowest death rates recorded in the category of atherosclerosis and degenerative heart disease had super high numbers in deaths recorded in the other category of other diseases of the heart. So it's safe to say that some of the deaths that were categorized as other diseases of the heart that Keys ignored were attributable to degenerative heart disease. If you combine those two categories, as many researchers since then have done, the association between saturated fat and heart disease just vanishes. It becomes statistically insignificant. There's really no association at all at that point. So we can only speculate as to why Keys chose not to combine those categories. But if he did, he would have had no chance to support his diet-heart hypothesis with the 7-country study. Now, another glaring weakness to the 7-country study is they collected data in Crete, Greece during Lent. Now, an Orthodox Catholic during Lent will not eat any animal products. And Keys didn't think that was a problem. But 60% of the population in Crete, Greece at that time were Orthodox Catholics. So quite obviously, the animal fat consumption would have gone way down during Lent. And that's the time Keys chose to do the research in Crete. So I'd say it's a little bit of a problem, a little bit of a bias showing up there. But that's not even the worst part. The biggest weakness in this study is that although Keys was able to show a weak correlation between people eating less saturated fat and having lower heart disease deaths, those same people died from all causes at higher rates. And that's a pretty important fact to bring out. All-cause mortality went up when saturated fat consumption went down. And isn't that what we're after here? Are we trying to prevent heart disease so that people can live longer? Well, people that ate the way Keys was recommending, with less saturated fat and more PUFAs in their diet, they died more frequently and therefore younger. Now, Ancel Keys isn't the only person to make this glaring omission when they publish the results of their research. When you look at the literature the way I have in preparation for this episode, you see proponents of the lipid hypothesis ignore this fact over and over again. It's the same mistake Colin Campbell made when he embarked on his China study research. The China study is a book that's become the holy grail for vegetarians, and Colin Campbell based that research on studies that he did with rats. And in Campbell's experiments, he fed some rats a low-protein diet, and he gave them a cancer-causing compound it was an aflatoxin, and those rats failed to develop liver cancer. In the other group of rats, he fed them a high-protein diet, gave them that same cancer-causing aflatoxin, and those rats developed liver cancer. So Campbell concluded that animal products are bad, and a low-protein, low-fat diet is better. And he advocates vegetarianism in his book. But what Campbell forgot to mention in his book, the China study, is that the low-protein rats died before the high-protein rats. So the high-protein rats, as tumor-ridden as they were, had the strength to outlive the low-protein rats without cancer. So apparently, early death is an effective way to prevent cancer. So anyway, it's a little absurd, but that's the truth. So let's get back to this heart studies. So the Framingham Heart Study that George Mann was a part of that we mentioned earlier, it started in 1948. And 6 years later, those researchers announced that they saw a connection between total cholesterol and heart disease deaths. And that was enough for most people to say, well, that's the problem. It's cholesterol. But in 1978, in a 30-year follow-up to the Framingham Heart Study, the connection between serum cholesterol and heart disease deaths became much less clear. The study director at the time said this, quote, "For each 1% milligram per deciliter drop of cholesterol, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality." That was the exact opposite of what researchers hoped to find. And it's consistent with what the 7-country study also found and failed to report, that when saturated fat intake and therefore cholesterol go down, all-cause mortality goes up. It's pretty amazing, and I know you probably haven't heard this before, but this is all true, folks, and I'm going to put some links in the show notes so you can read these studies on your own. Now, I want to mention one more study here. It's the Anti-Coronary Club. Now, this is an important study because this is the one that a lot of the people that are proponents of the lipid hypothesis will point to as proof that the diet heart hypothesis is accurate. It started in 1957, and researchers in New York enlisted 1,100 men. The authors of the study created what they called the prudent diet. They instructed these participants to reduce consumption of beef, lamb, pork, eggs, and dairy, and drink at least 2 tablespoons of polyunsaturated seed oils per day. And the control group, no changes. They ate the standard American diet, meat and potatoes, just keep doing what you've been doing. And they followed these people for 10 years. Now, 10 years into the study, they found a, quote, somewhat unusual results. 26 members of the diet club had died compared to only 6 men from the control group. And in their concluding statements, the researchers emphasized the improved risk factors that the men in the diet club enjoyed, namely lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, and they lost weight. But they ignored what those risk factors had blatantly failed to predict, their higher death rate. The results were buried in the study report and where most people wouldn't find it. They ignored what mattered most, Would eating this way help you live longer? The answer to that question in the Anti-Coronary Club was a resounding no. In fact, it's more likely to shorten your life. So we see this pattern over and over again. People are hoping to confirm the lipid hypothesis, and the studies show the exact opposite to be true. The diet-heart hypothesis, when put to the test, has never been proven. The only way something is considered to be proven in the research is to have multiple randomized controlled trials testing the same variables, and all the trials show consistent results across the board. Then something is accepted as established fact. That's never happened with the diet-heart hypothesis. Almost every study on the lipid hypothesis has been observational. And those observational studies, as I just pointed out, they're shot full of flaws, full of confounding variables, and all those faults muddy the water. It just makes things hard to really nail down. But there have been 6 randomized controlled trials done to test the lipid hypothesis. And every one of them shows that when saturated fat consumption goes down, death rates go up. Look at the study published in the journal Open Heart in January 2015. They say this: national dietary guidelines were introduced in 1977 and 1983 by the U.S. and UK governments, respectively, with the ambition of reducing coronary heart disease by reducing fat intake. Their conclusions? Dietary recommendations were introduced for 220 million United States and 56 million UK citizens by 1983 in the absence of supporting evidence from randomized controlled trials. In other words, it's never been proven. They just went with this diet-heart hypothesis theory and decided to adopt that into government policymaking. It's really tragic. You see, here's what I think happens. When researchers that have bought into the diet-heart hypothesis hook, line, and sinker, they believe that it is established fact, they see a study like the Anti-Coronary Club that shows people who consume more PUFAs lower their cholesterol and assume that that diet must be heart healthy. But they stop reading there, and they fail to recognize the fact that people that consume more PUFAs have more heart disease and die at higher rates than people who consume more saturated fat. Again, there's been 6 studies to date that prove this, but we don't have time to list them all, but I want to talk about one in particular. This one's the most important one of all of them, and it's called the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. Now, I'll bet you've never heard of this study, and if you have, drop a note in the comments or send me an email or get in touch with me in some way. I'd love to know if anybody listening has ever even heard of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. It took place from 1968 to 1973, about 5 years. Now, the results from this study didn't make it into the published literature and remained buried for more than 40 years. Now, it was a well-designed study. They had a captive audience. All the participants were either in a retirement home or state mental hospitals. People were randomized into 2 groups. The facilities had complete control over what the 2 groups ate. It was double-blind. None of the participants knew which diet they were getting. Not even the servers knew who was getting what. And they didn't speculate as to what the cause of death was, as Keys did. They performed autopsies in as many participants as they could. Now, occasionally the families objected to the autopsy being performed. That's understandable. But that was the goal, was to perform an autopsy on as many of the participants as they possibly could. And they did on more than half of the people that died during this study. Now, the results were finally published in the British Medical Journal in 2014. It was called Reevaluation of the Traditional Diet-Heart Hypothesis, Analysis of Recovered Data from the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, 1968 to 73. The design was this. The Minnesota Coronary Experiment is a double-blind, randomized controlled trial designed to test whether replacement of saturated fat with vegetable oil rich in linoleic acid reduces coronary heart disease and death by lowering serum cholesterol. Recovered MCE unpublished documents and raw data were analyzed according to the hypothesis specified by original investigators. Further, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials that lowered serum cholesterol by providing vegetable oil rich in linoleic acid in place of saturated fat without confounding by concomitant interventions was conducted. This is the study we've all been waiting for. You ready for this? Drum roll, please. The results? The intervention group had significant reduction in serum cholesterol compared with controls, 13.8% reduction on average. There was a 22% higher risk of death for each 30 milligrams per deciliter reduction in serum cholesterol. There was no evidence of benefit in the intervention group for coronary atherosclerosis by myocardial infarcts. Systematic review identified 5 randomized controlled trials for inclusion in the meta-analysis. These cholesterol-lowering interventions showed no evidence of benefit on mortality from coronary heart disease or all-cause mortality. Here's their conclusions. Available evidence from randomized controlled trials shows that replacement of saturated fat in the diet with linoleic acid effectively lowers serum cholesterol, but does not support the hypothesis that this translates to a lower risk of death from coronary heart disease or all causes. Findings from the Minnesota Coronary Experiment add to growing evidence that incomplete publication has contributed to overestimation of the benefits of replacing saturated fat with vegetable oil rich in linoleic acid. Drop the mic. This is what I've been saying all along for the past few episodes here. When you decrease your intake of saturated fat and replace those fats with polyunsaturated fatty acids in the form of seed oils, it increases heart disease and increases your chance of dying from all causes. Here's the graph demonstrating the higher death rates in the intervention group from the MCE. It's always good to see the visual. Now, the principal investigator of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, his name was Yvonne France. And I'll bet you can't guess who the co-principal investigator of this study was. Are you ready for this? Your friend and mine, Time magazine cover, Mr. Cholesterol himself, Ancel Keys. Drop the mic again. Okay, so can you believe that? That Ancel Keys actually performed the study that really needed to be done all along. Now, no one knows for sure why Keys chose not to publish this study. It's very unlikely that he didn't have the ability to, considering his notoriety and his influence in the field. We could only speculate. My speculation would be this, is Keys was so confident that he was right, and he was tired of hearing the criticism about people pointing out the weaknesses of the 7 countries observational study. So he said, bring it on. Let's design a study that cannot be refuted. So the Minnesota Coronary Experiment was born, and they executed it very well. It was well designed and well executed, probably the best one ever done on this topic. But the results were probably shocking to both Keys and the rest of the researchers. Now, that's speculation on my part, but we do know this. Keys was heavily invested in his diet heart hypothesis. A lot of money was riding on it, and if he did publish results from the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, he would have had to eat some humble pie and tell his friends over there at the NIH, hey guys, I was wrong all these years. Our dietary guidelines need to be modified. Considering what a hard-headed person he was, that wasn't about to happen. There's a lot more to say on this. I mean, I had a hard time just kind of sifting through all the data that I had to not include too much in one episode here, but I think that's enough for now. So where do we go from here? What do we do? Well, as promised, I want to give you my recommendations for cleaning up your diet and drastically reducing the amount of seed oils that you're exposed to. Now, let me say this. Different people have different tolerance as to how much seed oils they can consume in their diet. I personally believe that if you're younger, it's easier to tolerate and put up with the detrimental effects of seed oils in your tissues than it is when you're older. Now, if you're over 40, like most people listening to this podcast are, you have a little bit less margin, a little bit less wiggle room. Now, if you're over 60, like I am, you have even less wiggle room. So you should, if you are older, or if you're dealing with a serious health challenge, just consider yourself to have a little bit less margin, a little bit less wiggle room when it comes to cheating on these recommendations that I'm about to give you. But it's definitely possible. You can do this. Your body is capable of detoxing from these oils. And when you do, it's going to be worth the effort. Now, you want to strive to limit your PUFA intake to under 5 milligrams a day if you're really disciplined. You could go up to 10 milligrams a day, be a little bit more of a looser standard if you weren't dealing with serious health challenge. One of the ways you can measure that is an app called Chronometer. It's a little bit complicated to use, but once you learn how to use it, you can figure this stuff out. It's a good way to keep track of your linoleic acid intake. Again, remember that the half-life of linoleic acid in our bodies is 680 days. So it would take you about 2 years to eliminate half of the linoleic acid that's in your cells and tissues. Take you about 5 years to reduce it by 95% if you're really disciplined. That's the bad news. But the good news is if you start implementing, you will start feeling better in a few weeks or maybe a few months. It's going to help, and you're going to notice a difference. I have my own life. I've been eating this way, pretty disciplined for the last 6 months or so. And I already can notice a pretty noticeable difference. My mental clarity is better. My energy is better. I'm sleeping better. There's a lot of benefits to this, folks. And I highly recommend that you consider some of the things I'm saying here and really take them to heart. So what do? Resolve to eat more food at home. Prepare more of your own meals. If you're going to work and you have to find yourself eating lunch or dinner at work, prepare your food at home and take it with you. So you want to cut way back on eating in restaurants. As I said in the last episode, restaurants love to cook with seed oils. And it's a virtual certainty that salad dressing that you get with a salad is loaded with seed oils. So if you're eating out and you must have a salad, use olive oil, use oil and vinegar. But even then, that olive oil in a restaurant is very likely to be adulterated with seed oils. It's very common practice in the industry to cut that 100% pure olive oil down with a lesser expensive seed oil. A couple studies have been done, and they say over 80 to 90% of the olive oil sitting on the grocery store shelf is adulterated with seed oils. So you gotta expect to pay more, a lot more, if you're going to get pure olive oil. Now, if you have to eat out, you could practice some defensive eating. This is something I do a lot of. If you know you're going to be eating a meal out, you know there's going to be some cheating going on, have a snack on some healthy food before you leave the house. That way, when you are presented with the unhealthy food, you can have a smaller portion. And that way you won't look like, you're a complete outcast and you're not going to enjoy a meal with your friends and colleagues or whatever the case may be. You can also eat some cheese or ice cream when you cheat on seed oils, because cheese and ice cream are both high in saturated fat, and those fats will compete for space within our cells. And if you have some healthy saturated fat with those seed oils, the impact of the seed oils is going to be lessened. You'll minimize the amount of seed oils your cells take up. If you're going over a friend's house for a Bible study or something like that, you can offer to prepare a dish and bring it with you. And that way you can make sure you have healthy ingredients in that. As I recommended in episode 139, you want to start increasing your consumption of meat and organs from ruminant animals. Ruminant animals are cows, lamb, sheep, bison, venison. Fermented dairy is great. As long as you don't have a food sensitivity to dairy, it's great. It's always better to consume dairy in its fermented form. It's a little bit like pre-digested that way. It makes it easier on your stomach, easier to digest. Yogurt is good. Kefir, which is a drinkable yogurt. And of course, cheese, and raw cheese is best. Now, if you buy raw cheese at the grocery store, it's going to cost you more, but you want to make sure that you don't heat that cheese, because if you heat it and melt it, then it's not raw anymore. Now, this is a big one. Don't eat anything deep fried in seed oils. One of the worst things you could probably put down your throat would be a donut. I mean, it's so loaded with toxins, cooked in the most toxic substance there is, and that's high temperature seed oils that have probably been used for several days, if not weeks, being spoiled at high temperature. They're extraordinarily toxic. A close runner-up would be French fries or chicken wings, cooked in these high temperature seed oils, extraordinarily toxic. Now, wings would be okay if they were baked, but there's still problems with poultry and pork, because those two crops are fed inexpensive commercial feed, which contain high amounts of corn and soy. And corn and soy are cheap because our government heavily subsidizes those two crops. And if you're a factory farmer and you don't really care about the health of your animals or the health of the people consuming your products, you're going to go with the cheaper feed. Another thing you want to limit is bread, especially when you eat out. Most commercial bread has seed oils added to it. Unless you're buying the grains and making the bread yourself, be very careful and read the ingredients when it comes to bread. Most of it has seed oils added. Not only that, flour made from wheat is nothing more than ground up seeds. And seeds are the most heavily defended part of a plant, so therefore they're high in lectins and oxalic acid and those types of things. And those plant defense chemicals make it difficult to digest for a lot of people. You also want to limit your nuts and seeds. Most nuts are very high in linoleic acid. The best nut to consume if you enjoy nuts and you want to reduce your linoleic acid intake would be macadamia nuts. They only have about 1% of their fat from linoleic acid. Second to that would be cashews at 8%, hazelnuts at 12%, then pistachios at 13%. Most other nuts are very, very high in linoleic acid. A handful of almonds once in a while is okay. Almonds have 16% linoleic acid. So a little bit once in a while is not going to hurt you. Again, we do need to consume some linoleic acid, but we want to keep it down around 1 to 2%. And take some drastic changes to your diet in order to do that. So that's my thoughts on saturated fat and seed oils. It's my hope that you would use this episode as a reference. Bookmark it, watch it a couple of times, listen to it a couple of times so that you can really let this information sink in. Learn this information so you can share it with other people, share it with your loved ones, because it's really life-giving information. Be sure to check out the next episode. I'm speaking with Eddie O'Connor, and he is a licensed sports psychologist. And we're going to be talking about mental toughness and how we can be in charge of our thought lives. The Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 10:5 to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So if our thoughts are going to be in obedience to us, we can't be letting our thoughts run the show. We need to be in charge of them. Our thought lives should be serving us, not the other way around. So that's going to be a great episode. You don't want to miss it. So remember, I'd love to hear from you. If you've got a question and you'd like me to answer it on an upcoming episode, go to my website, davidsandstrom.com. Leave me a voice message there, and I'll do my best to answer your question on an upcoming episode. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you. I'll talk with you next time. Be blessed.